Bill Maher leans back in his chair, smirking as the studio laughter trails off. "Come on, Congresswoman," he says, voice half teasing, half dismissing. "Let's be real. People are tired of identity talk. Don't you think it's gone too far?" The crowd chuckles, unsure if they should. Jasmine Crockett doesn't move. Her hands rest on the table, steady, deliberate. She studies him for a moment, not angry, not amused, just present. The silence stretches until it becomes louder than his laughter. Then she speaks. "You know, Bill, the funny thing about being tired of identity," she says softly, "is that it usually comes from the people who've never had theirs used against them." The air shifts. A ripple moves through the audience. Someone in the front row murmurs, "Oh," under their breath. Maher blinks, that smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. He tries to recover, gesturing broadly. No, I'm just saying, can we talk about ideas instead of labels?" Crockett nods once. "I'm all for ideas," she replies, voice steady. "But if you ignore the labels that shaped people's lives, you're not debating ideas. You're erasing context." The applause starts small, hesitant, then swells. Cameras flash. Maher shifts in his seat, forced to wait for it to die down. She continues, her tone calm but unyielding. "Every time someone tells me to stop talking about race or gender or struggle, I think, what a privilege, to treat other people's realities like a distraction." The audience erupts. Even the band looks impressed. Maher raises an eyebrow, searching for a comeback, but none arrives quickly enough. He laughs, the practiced sound of someone used to control, now slipping from his grasp. Crockett glances his way again, the faintest smile tugging at the edge of her mouth. "You asked to be real," she says. That's as real as it gets. For a moment, no one breathes. The applause builds again, louder, more certain this time. On social media, the clip will be looping within minutes. The headlines will call it "The Silence Heard Around Late Night." But inside the studio, all that exists is the tension between a fading smirk and the calm of a woman who refused to shrink, and what she says next will make that silence unforgettable. The invitation had sounded harmless enough. "An open conversation about the state of American politics," Maher's team said. "A spirited, respectful exchange." Jasmine Crockett agreed, because she believed in dialogue, even when it came wrapped in ego. But from the moment she walked on set, she could feel it. The temperature of the room wasn't curiosity, it was challenge. Maher greeted her with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, the kind reserved for guests he planned to test. To him, this was sport. To her, it was another stage to say what needed to be said. The cameras rolled and the tone shifted fast. Maher framed his questions like traps. Do progressives really understand how regular people think? Isn't Congress just theater now? Maybe activism has become performance. Each one dripped with the assumption that he already knew the answer. The crowd laughed when he wanted them to, clapped when prompted. But something about Crockett's calm refusal to take the bait made the laughter feel thinner, nervous. Because outside that studio, her name was rising. Clips of her fiery committee hearings, calling out hypocrisy with surgical precision, had made her a social media force. Her voice wasn't just another politician's. It carried the edge of someone who had fought to be heard long before microphones found her. In that moment, she represented something bigger, a generation of women, of progressives, of people tired of being told to tone it down just to be taken seriously. Maher, in contrast, had made a career out of cynicism. His monologues mocked the extremes. His smirk dismissed both left and right. But that night, his favorite trick, dismantling young idealists with irony, wasn't landing because Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't match sarcasm with sarcasm. She used truth like a scalpel, cutting through the noise without raising her voice. It was no longer a talk show segment. It was a generational collision, one side defending comfort, the other demanding courage. And as Maher leaned forward, preparing his next jab, he still thought he was steering the conversation. He didn't know that the next exchange would flip the entire room and leave him staring at a truth he couldn't joke his way out of. For decades, Bill Maher has built his brand on discomfort. his audience tuning in not just for conversation but for confrontation. He was the man who said what others wouldn't, who laughed where others hesitated. But beneath the applause and late-night wit, something had shifted. The sharp edge that once cut through hypocrisy had dulled into cynicism. The line between challenging and condescending blurred long ago. He used to spar with giants, intellectuals, journalists, politicians who could volley his sarcasm back with equal force. But over the years, the game changed. He began punching sideways, sometimes down, mocking the same progressives whose causes once gave his monologues relevance. "I'm not woke," he'd boast, to predictable cheers. His audience, once diverse and defiant, had aged with him, content to laugh at the idealism of a world that had moved on, and Maher relished the role of provocateur. He called it free thinking. His critics called it something else, deflection wrapped in intellect. When challenged, he'd tilt his head, smile that familiar smile, and say, "I'm just asking questions." That was the phrase, his shield and his weapon. The disarming prelude to every dismissive jab. The audience would laugh, the guest would tense, and the rhythm of control would continue until Jasmine Crockett. Because this time, the formula didn't hold. The same smirk that usually dismantled guests began to look like armor. Each interruption felt heavier, each punchline more forced. The crowd wasn't laughing the same way, they were watching. Maher thrived on control, but control depends on predictability. And Crockett didn't play predictable. She didn't shrink, she didn't shout, and worst of all for him, she didn't give him the caricature he wanted. She gave him truth. In that silence, after her first response, Maher's rhythm faltered. It was the look of a man realizing the script might not go his way. The irony was painful. The host who made a career out of exposing hypocrisy was suddenly face-to-face with his own. And the world, watching in real time, sensed it too. Long before she ever sat across from Bill Maher, Jasmine Crockett learned what it meant to stand alone in a room and refuse to back down. Born in Texas, she wasn't supposed to make it this far, at least that's what the odds said. She came from the kind of background that didn't get airtime on national television, working class, Southern, black, and female, in a state that rarely made space for all four at once. She didn't inherit power. She had to outwork it, outthink it, and outlast it. Her path started in law. As a civil rights attorney, Crockett didn't just argue cases, she fought for people who had been told their pain didn't count. Police brutality, housing discrimination, voter suppression. She didn't just speak about injustice. She stood in front of it. The courtroom became her first arena, the bench her first audience. Every victory was personal, every loss fuel for the next fight. Then came Congress. The same voice that had once defended the voiceless was now on record, challenging hypocrisy with the same clarity she'd honed in court. It didn't take long for the public to notice. Clips of her interrogations during hearings began to circulate online. Moments where she exposed evasions and double standards with razor precision. Social media fell in love with her tone. No nonsense, no theatrics, just controlled fire. She became a symbol for a generation tired of politeness being mistaken for passivity. Her words traveled fast because they carried something rare, conviction without apology. And yet, what made her rise remarkable wasn't just what she said. It was how she carried herself when people tried to silence her, the calm in her voice when men interrupted, the poise she maintained when the headlines reduced her to caricature, the dignity that made even her critics admit she couldn't be rattled. That composure wasn't accidental. It came from years of being underestimated. Every debate in school, every courtroom glare, every talk show host who thought her intelligence could be dismissed with a smirk. It all trained her for this. By the time she stepped onto Maher's stage, she wasn't there to win an argument. She was there to represent the millions who had watched people like her get talked over and laughed off for daring to speak the truth too clearly. She knew Maher's type, the reasonable skeptic who dressed dismissiveness as dialogue. She'd met versions of him her entire life, but she also knew something he didn't, that reason without empathy was just arrogance in disguise. So when the lights came up and the audience applauded, she sat steady. Every camera pointed at her, every subtle power dynamic alive in that studio. And still, she looked calm. Because she'd already survived rooms colder and harder than this one. For Maher, this was another Friday night. For Crockett, it was a moment of reclamation, not just for herself, but for the voices like hers that had been talked over for generations. And as the first exchange of the night gave way to sharper questions, she didn't tense up. She leaned in, ready, because this wasn't just an interview, it was a reckoning years in the making, and when Maher thought he'd finally found the question that would trip her, what he really found was the calm before the storm that would change the tone of the entire night. But the woman across from him wasn't done. Because before the night was over, she would turn that smirk into a lesson the internet wouldn't let him forget. The tension had settled into the air like humidity, thick, invisible, undeniable. Maher leaned forward, index cards in hand, the glint of challenge flickering behind his smirk. He'd tested her patience with interruptions and hypotheticals, but now he was pushing harder, pressing for that viral moment he could own. "So let me get this straight," he said, gesturing with his pen. "You're saying America's problems boil down to identity? Isn't that just feelings over facts?" A few audience members laughed, unsure if they were supposed to. Crockett didn't move. "I'm saying identity is a fact, Bill," she replied. "It shapes who gets heard and who gets dismissed as emotional when they tell the truth." The studio went quiet again, too quiet for comfort. Maher laughed, the kind that sounds like a cue for applause. "Come on, Congresswoman, you can't blame everything on privilege." That word's lost all meaning. Crockett tilted her head, eyes steady. "It's only meaningless to the people who've never had to see it," she said. The audience murmured. The band's drummer tapped a soft beat, nervous energy leaking into the silence. Maher tried to pivot. "I'm just saying we can't keep dividing people." "Division happens when people refuse to acknowledge difference." Crockett interrupted, her voice even. "I'm not dividing. I'm describing reality." Her words hit like a slow echo. The audience, caught between laughter and awe, finally chose silence. Even Maher hesitated, caught mid-grin, realizing the rhythm had shifted again, and not in his favor. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged looks. They could feel it, too. The energy in the room was no longer Maher's to control. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her tone soft but cutting. You keep asking if people are too sensitive," she said. "Maybe the question is why some folks are so fragile when they're asked to listen." That line landed like a stone in water, ripples spreading outward, audience stunned. Maher blinked. For once he had no comeback ready. The crowd's applause broke through, scattered but growing. Crockett didn't smile. She just waited for the noise to settle, because the real moment, the one that would shatter the illusion of control completely, was about to begin. It began with a pause. That quiet, deliberate silence before a truth drops heavier than any insult. Maher leaned back, sensing he'd hit a nerve. But he couldn't see that the balance had already shifted. He raised his eyebrows, tone dripping with that trademark smirk. "Look, Jasmine, I get it, you're passionate. But don't you think activists like you scare off moderates? I mean, half the country doesn't want a lecture every time they turn on the TV." The audience chuckled, scattered, hesitant. Maher smiled wider, mistaking politeness for agreement. Crockett looked at him unblinking. "You think it's a lecture because you're not used to listening." The lines sliced clean through the air. The laughter stopped instantly. Maher's smile flickered, unsure whether to defend or deflect. She leaned forward, voice steady, calm, every word enunciated like a verdict. "You say people don't want to hear about race or justice or equality because it makes them uncomfortable. But Bill, discomfort isn't oppression. Discomfort is how growth begins." A murmur rose from the audience, soft at first, then swelling. Someone clapped. Another joined. Maher tried to pivot, forcing a laugh. "I'm all for growth, Congresswoman, but can't we grow without all the guilt?" She tilted her head slightly. "You mean accountability?" The crowd erupted. Maher laughed again, the sound empty now, glancing toward his panel as if for rescue. None came. Crockett didn't let the energy drop. "You built a career asking tough questions," she said. "But tonight, you're asking the wrong ones. The real question isn't why people talk about injustice, it's why so many get angry when they do." The words hung there, sharp, clean, undeniable. The audience leaned in, drawn to the composure behind the conviction. She continued, her tone softening but her gaze never breaking. "Every time you call it woke, what you're really saying is, stop reminding me. Every time someone like me stands up and you roll your eyes, what you're saying is, I don't want to see how far we still have to go." But Bill, pretending not to see, never changed a thing. Now the applause wasn't hesitant. It was thunderous. Even the camera operators grinned, capturing the moment they knew would go viral before the show even ended. Maher sat back, crossing his arms, half smiling as if to pretend control, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Crockett gave a faint, knowing smile. "You asked earlier if activism scares moderates. Maybe it does, but silence should scare all of us more." The audience rose to its feet. The cheers lasted long enough to drown out whatever Maher might have said next. Crockett didn't gloat. She just waited for the noise to fade, the calm returning to her voice like a closing argument. "You call it a debate," she said quietly. "I call it a reminder. Because for some of us, this isn't politics, it's survival." Applause again, rolling like thunder, echoing through the studio. Maher looked at her, then at the crowd, then back again, half a smile, half a grimace. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The night was no longer his. In the control room, producers whispered, "That's the clip." And as the applause swelled again, her final line still hung in the air, measured, unflinching, unforgettable. The smirk was gone, and in its place, the stunned silence of a man realizing he'd just lost the debate he thought he controlled. The moment the cameras cut, the silence lingered longer than anyone expected. Maher tried to laugh it off, but even his producers looked uneasy. Everyone knew they'd just witnessed something that would outlive the episode. Within minutes, phones lit up. The clip had already hit social media before the studio audience left their seats. A single tweet led the charge. "Jasmine Crockett just dismantled Bill Maher with one sentence. You think it's a lecture because you're not used to listening." The post exploded, thousands of retweets in minutes, followed by the inevitable flood of hashtags. Crockett clapped back. Maher meltdown, composure over chaos. By morning, the internet was ablaze. TikTok edits paired Crockett's mic drop moment with cinematic music. Gen Z creators called it a masterclass in grace under fire. Commentators from every corner of the political spectrum chimed in, some defending Maher, most admitting he'd finally met someone who wouldn't play his game. Even late-night rivals mentioned it with a grin. Bill Maher got fact-checked. Live, the view count soared. 1 million, 3, 10, then 20. The clip transcended politics. It became a cultural moment. Every outlet wanted a statement from Crockett. Instead, she tweeted just 3 words: "Grace wins again." It was retweeted by celebrities, activists, even a few stunned political figures who rarely agreed on anything. Maher's camp tried to frame it as healthy debate, but online, the narrative had already crystallized. One woman's calm had exposed a generation's cynicism. The more they replayed the clip, the clearer it became. Crockett hadn't humiliated him. She'd outgrown the entire argument. Comment sections filled with people sharing personal viewers who'd been interrupted, dismissed, talked over, now seeing themselves reflected in her composure. "She didn't shout," one wrote. "She just refused to be smaller." Even Maher's most loyal fans couldn't deny the power of the moment. The comment that rose to the top on YouTube said it best. He tried to control the room. She controlled the truth. And as networks scrambled to capitalize on the debate she'd ended with a whisper, Jasmine Crockett went back to work, calm, steady, unmoved, because for her, the moment was never about the takedown. It was about reminding America who really gets the last word. By the following week, the noise had reached a fever pitch. talk shows, podcasts, and op-eds all orbiting one question. How did a congresswoman from Texas flip the script on national television without ever raising her voice? But beneath the headlines, something deeper was happening. People weren't just replaying the viral clip, they were replaying the feeling it left behind. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't simply won a debate. She'd revealed something about power, that true authority doesn't come from volume, interruptions, or a bigger platform. It comes from clarity, from owning your truth so fully that no one can twist it into something else. In classrooms, young women were sharing the clip as a lesson in confidence. In offices, people whispered about it during breaks. That's exactly how you handle someone who talks down to you. On college campuses, students used it to discuss the generational rift in American politics, a clash between those who mock idealism and those who live it. And through it all, Crockett stayed silent. She didn't boast or gloat. She didn't post victory memes. She let the clip and her composure speak for her. That restraint became the story's moral heartbeat, grace as strength, dignity as defiance. Reporters eventually asked her about it during a press gaggle. She smiled softly and said, "I wasn't trying to go viral. I was trying to be heard." Then she paused, glanced up from the podium, and added, "Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you give, even when it's not given back." That line became the headline everywhere. It was shared beside images of her calm expression, of Maher's uneasy smirk, of a studio audience caught mid-applause. It captured the moment's essence, not outrage, but evolution. Because Crockett's exchange with Maher wasn't about television at all. It was about what happens when truth sits across from ego and refuses to flinch. And in that refusal, a new kind of power was born, the quiet kind that doesn't need to dominate to be unforgettable. But just when the dust seemed to settle, one unexpected moment reignited the conversation, and it came from Maher himself. A week later, Bill Maher finally addressed the viral exchange on his own show. The studio audience leaned forward, waiting for sarcasm, maybe a jab, maybe another attempt to set the record straight. Instead, Maher sighed, glanced at his notes, and muttered, "Maybe." I was a little too dismissive. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement anyone expected. And in that moment, the cultural tide had already turned. The clip wasn't just a trending topic anymore. It was a reference point. Because every viewer who'd watched Jasmine Crockett hold her ground without flinching saw something that felt larger than politics. They saw possibility, proof that dignity could disarm arrogance, that calm could outshine condescension, and that truth, when spoken without fear, could travel faster than mockery ever would. That's why millions kept sharing it, long after the algorithms moved on. Parents showed it to their kids. Activists used it as inspiration in community meetings. And online, people wrote things like, "This is why we show up. This is why we vote." Crockett herself said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her silence had become a symbol of composure under pressure, of what it looks like when grace becomes its own kind of protest. And as the music swells, the voiceover brings it home. Sometimes history doesn't announce itself with a march or a headline. Sometimes it's a moment on live television, when someone refuses to shrink. The screen flashes images of that now iconic exchange. Maher leaning back, speechless. Crockett steady, grounded, unbothered. In a world that rewards noise, she proved that calm can still be revolutionary. Fade to black. Then, the narrator's voice returns, not as commentary, but as invitation. If you believe that dignity still matters, that truth spoken with grace still carries power, share this story. Because the next time someone tries to talk over you, remember Jasmine Crockett. And remember, you never need to raise your voice to raise the bar. The screen lingers on her final quote. White text on black, grace wins again. Then, soft outro music, the faint hum of applause, and a single closing line. Subscribe for more stories where truth stands tall, even when the world tries to talk it down.